was initially puzzled by the seemingly random patchwork nature of the Utah neighborhood I moved to a decade ago. Pockets of 1950s houses next to streets of homes from the 70s, 80s, and 90s, interspersed with single, small, 100-year-old houses and cul-de-sacs of brand new mega mansions. Why, I wondered. It turns out that the area of town used to be dominated by orchards, and a few of which still exist. And the suburban development unfolded episodically as families sold off agricultural lands to developers. Welcome to Writing Westward. I'm your host, Brendan Redsink. This month we speak with historian Jason A. Heppler about his book, Silicon Valley and the Environmental Inequalities of High-Tech Urbanism. He turns our attention to California's Santa Clara Valley by asking similar why questions about the region's development, and he uncovers clear answers that intersect urban history with economic development, environmental pollution, racial and social segregation, and much more that applies to where I live in Utah and likely where you live in the West as well. Thanks for listening. For new listeners, here's a brief introduction to the podcast and myself. Writing Westward is a monthly podcast featuring conversations with historians, journalists, scientists, and scholars from various disciplines who are writing about the North American West. The goal of these exchanges is to spark your curiosity to think more deeply about the region, its lands and environments, and the histories and experiences of the peoples who have called it home. Writing Westward is supported by the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University, where I, Brendan Redsink, serve as Associate Director and I'm a Professor of History. For better or worse, this is a one-man operation. I am the host, producer, sound engineer, publicist, and everything else, all roles for which I have zero training. But I am passionate about the North American West, and I'll take any excuse to read more and talk to interesting people who are writing about the region. If a guest intrigues you, you can find links to their work in the show notes or at writingwestward.org. If you have a moment, please subscribe and leave reviews wherever you get your podcasts. Share links with friends and follow us on Facebook, Blue Sky, or X, Twitter, and send in some feedback. At the end of the episode, I will include some more information about my own scholarship and the Redd Center, our programming and projects, and funding opportunities that you could apply for. That's right, we may want to give you money. And with that, let me introduce who we are talking to this month and why. Dr. Jason A. Heppler is a historian and digital historian, currently working as senior developer at the Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media and an adjunct professor of history at George Mason University. He earned a bachelor's in history from South Dakota State University and a master's and PhD in history from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Prior to his current positions at George Mason, he held posts at Stanford University's Center for Spatial and Textual Analysis, Department of History, and Center for Interdisciplinary Digital Research, and the University of Nebraska at Omaha's Sustainability Minor Program, Libraries, and History Department. He co-edited a 2020 University of Cincinnati Press volume with Rebecca Wingo, Digital Community Engagement, Partnering Communities with the Academy, which won the 2021 National Council on Public History Book Award. His first monograph, which we talk about today, Silicon Valley and the Environmental Inequalities of High-Tech Urbanism, was published in 2024 by the University of Oklahoma Press as Volume 9 in their Environment in Modern North America series. In this book, Heppler traces development in the Santa Clara Valley of California as it transitioned from a bucolic agricultural landscape first to one that attracted light industry with early tech and electronics manufacturers and research outfits, and a rustic, rural style of suburbia, then later to a fully urbanized world by the 1980s. Along the way, by asking why the landscape looked the way it did, Heppler explores how the supposedly quote-unquote clean tech industry that Stanford University attracted to lease its vast land holdings, and the land developers who promoted resulting suburban development was anything but clean. As the years went on, residents discovered that these clean industries were, in fact, profoundly polluting the land and groundwater. Heppler shows how the negative health impacts of those development decisions were borne unevenly, as city planners segregated communities and developed infrastructures unequally between them. For anyone living in the suburban West and urban West, which constitutes the overwhelming majority of Western residents, this book will set off all kinds of alarms. The debates over suburban, urban, industrial, and commercial development are ubiquitous and likely feature prominently in the city council or county planning commission meetings where you live in the West. Heppler's exploration of Silicon Valley can help all of us learn how to read the developed and undeveloped lands around us and know what questions to ask about why they are the way they are and what environmental, economic, social, and cultural factors we should be considering when making decisions about how they are used or transformed. Of the many books we have featured on this podcast, Heppler's may simultaneously be the one with the narrowest geographic scope and the broadest geographic relevance. This is excellent history, incisive, thought-provoking, and full of information and ideas that are widely applicable to Western life today. Dr. Jason Heppler, welcome to Writing Westward.
Hey, yeah, thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
We're just talking, and we need to warn listeners that if there's any weird audio glitches, it's because you have maybe some thunderstorms or stuff rolling through.
Yeah, hopefully we won't have any issues, but
no tornadoes.
Not this time. Just rain today. Yeah.
I wanted to start by talking a little bit about urban history, kind of broadly as a subfield, and specifically urban history in the West. I think when most people, even Westerners, if you say, describe what the West looks like, envision it in your mind, I think people envision rural spaces because the land is predominantly rural. But in terms of populations, it's the most urban region in the United States, which I think is counterintuitive a little bit. Can you talk to us a little bit about kind of this subfield of urban history and how and when it kind of started becoming integrated into the study of the West as a region?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think you're right that there is this tendency to think of the West as this predominantly rural thing. But as you point out, it's a very urban place, and it's been a very urban place for a long time. I think part of the problem here is, I'm sure your listeners probably get tired of harping on Frederick Jackson Turner, but it really is kind of
we can never get enough.
That's good. It's sort of the Turner problem again, right? Like Turner's whole frontier thesis, I think, is sort of predicated on this idea that cities don't have a role on the frontier, right? Like if they're here, then the frontier is not there anymore. And I think because of that, we ended up with this sort of rural lens that we bring to the West for a really long time. And that idea of rural settlement, I think, in the closing of the frontier, I think really just leaves almost no room to really think about cities as a place in the West. That begins to change really in, let's say the late 50s, early 60s is when you start to get some of the earliest moments of that, of people trying to sort of pierce at that idea a little bit. You have Richard Wade's work, for example, who writes a book called The Urban Frontier, I think in 1960 or 59, somewhere in there, who's sort of saying like, well, actually cities are this like way of piercing through the frontier and they're sort of helping bring the West forward, right? I think that's a problematic interpretation, but nevertheless, it's like this idea of trying to think about cities as having a place in the West. I think where this really starts to change is you see work by, say, Lawrence Larson, who wrote this book, The Urban West at the End of the Frontier in the late 1970s. And it's really the first time somebody tries to synthesize a lot of Western cities. I think he looks at 24 cities or so across the West as a way to think about, what are these growth patterns that cities go through? What does urbanization look like? And trying to think about this sort of frontier work going on at the same time as cities growing, right? It's all part of this one process. That, I think, changes a lot with the rise of the new Western historians who, looking at Patty Limerick or Richard White, or Bill Cronin especially, I think his book on Chicago, Nature's Metropolis, really does kind of change the way we think about cities in the West, right? They're not these isolated things. They're not separate from nature. They're not separate from rural places. They have a great impact on the ecology around a place, or they have a great impact on the Great Plains or something like that. And I think you continue to see that through the 1980s, 1990s, as you have Richard White writing about the Pacific Northwest or Matt Klingel looking at Seattle. You have these moments of Western historians looking at specific cities and what their experience is like, sometimes in the 19th century, sometimes in the 20th century. Carl Abbott really changes, I think, the field quite a lot. He's sort of the first, I think, to synthesize a lot of this work in the 1990s, and really also brings in the story of like post 1940s for the West, for the urban West in particular. And, I think on the backs of that, you have this like wave of new people that are writing about the West. Jared Orsi's doing stuff on Los Angeles, or David Gutierrez on Mexican American experiences in the urban West, or Ken Blanchett, who just wrote a book a few years ago on indigenous urban spaces, or Maina Guy, who's writing about Asian experiences and Asian communities across the West. And so you get this broader understanding, I think, of Western cities through these different lenses, and trying to understand and demonstrate that these, I think there's a centrality of cities to the West. And they've always been here. People have always been in them. And so I think there's a lot of ways that urban history did shape a lot of Western approaches and thinking about, how we write about the West. But I would also say that the field of Western history has also shaped the way that urban history is done as a methodology. And I think especially the West and Western historians thinking about, environmental approaches and environmental history, especially, and sort of emphasizing this regional context, is all sort of emanating out of Western history and changing the way that I think urban historians also write about these places.
What I think is sometimes interesting, though, is I was just thinking about all the books on my shelves, and in Mexican American history, Asian American history, labor history, there's all these other subfields. And as I think about it, a lot of the really prominent books in all those subfields are all in urban or suburban settings. But urban history isn't the first category I ever put them in, right? I mean, a lot of our work fits in multiple boxes.
Right.
And for these Western ones, I don't know. As I think about it, I'm like, I think actually a lot more of the books on my shelves are urban history than I've really, given them credit for.
Yeah.
Or my students are always surprised if we're doing, 20th century America and we start talking about suburban growth in the post-World War II era. And one time a student was like, why are all the examples you're using all like Arizona and California? Is it just because you're a Western historian? I was like, no. Like the early stages of suburbia as we know it today are often kind of a Sunbelt Western story.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. I sort of feel like I fell into urban history. Like I never really thought of myself as an urban historian when I started. Well, when I started graduate school, certainly, but also even as the Silicon Valley book started to take shape, I didn't really think of myself as an urban historian. It did sort of it sort of emerged, I guess, as I was trying to write about this place. And I had to do kind of this like crash course in urban history. It was just, as you say, I read a lot of stuff about the urban West, but I never really, through grad school and whatnot, I never really read a whole lot about the field of urban history. And so there was this also like this moment in my writing of this that I had to like figure this all out.
You're
And
like, wait,
really,
am I an urban historian now?
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Exactly. It was all kind of, I don't know, not what I expected.
Yeah. Like with my first book, it was pretty far into it that I realized like, I'm doing labor history.
Yeah.
And that is not a field that I'm very well versed in. And I
Yeah.
had to do some crash course stuff in that. Well, I was going to say that you've been long involved in digital humanities, digital history work. You're light years ahead of all of us in terms of being tech savvy. I mean, that's your job right now. You're a digital historian. So a study on Silicon Valley, when I heard this is what you were going to do for your dissertation and the book, I was like, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense. A lot of his work is just doing digital history, but in terms of content, like, yeah, why wouldn't he? Of course, he'd be writing about Silicon Valley.
Sure.
Um, but what surprised me is the environmental lens, this urban history lens, the race and class and economics. There's all kinds of things that I don't know why I didn't think they would be in there. But can you kind of walk us through? I mean, you already hinted at it that you didn't realize you were going to be doing urban history, and then oops, you are. Like, how do you get to this topic from maybe thinking I'll write about Silicon Valley to
Yeah.
what you actually end up writing?
Yeah. No, that's a great question. I mean, the roots of this, I guess, like so many things, the roots of this is like in my professors in grad school, who always seem to know a lot more than I do about, what I need to be doing. I think where this started was I ended up writing this historiographical paper. I can't even remember what year it would have been, but I did it for Doug Seafeld, who was teaching Western history at University of Nebraska-Lincoln at the time. And the purpose of that paper was, I think the title was something like Urbanization, Industrialization, and the New West, or something like that. So I was reading Carl Abbott and George Nash and all these people, John Finley and others, and I sort of credit that paper with getting me to think about this stuff in a different way. I wasn't at the time really thinking about Silicon Valley early in grad school. I was actually writing about indigenous activism in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, which is where I sort of started in grad school. But writing this paper for Doug, and it just got me thinking a lot more about urban spaces and industrialization in the West in a way that I just really hadn't before. And it was interesting. Look, it was a way of thinking about the West that I'd not really been exposed to until, I had this moment with these different moments, I guess, in graduate school. But I will say at the time when I started this project, the environmental history stuff actually really wasn't on my radar all that much. The original concept of this book was I actually wanted to write a history of the internet. And I was interested in that because the early internet, ARPANET, emerges in the West. It's at these like 3 or 4 cities across the West, in the far West, which I always thought was interesting. And I thought there was something to say about, I don't know, but conditions that existed in these places, at these universities, in these cities that would lead them to be good candidates for the internet as we've come to know it today. Where this all changed is right after I defended my prospectus, I ended up getting hired at Stanford University and moved out to California. So I was living in the place I was writing about. I mean, I'm one of these historians who's like, if you're going to write about a place, you should visit the place, right? There's part of that. But I was living in the place, which really, I think, changed the way I thought about it quite a lot. And the environmental angle to this whole project really started because I was on a hike. And I was up above a reservoir just outside of San Jose where we lived. And we were like up in the hills looking down. And I looked down and there's this reservoir outside the city. And I was like, I wonder why that's there. I wonder why they built this. Like, what's it feed? Who's it for? And like that question about water in Silicon Valley really is what got me thinking differently about this whole thing. And so when I started going back to the archives right after this hike, I started to really look for things about water. And as I was looking for things about water is when I found things about pollution, and I found all these other issues that were going on in the valley related to water use and contamination and high tech. And so that's sort of where it all came from is like one, being exposed to certain things in graduate school, and then like being in this place and thinking about this space a little bit differently made me realize like there's a story here that we haven't really talked about. I think there's a tendency sometimes when we talk about Silicon Valley is we think of it in these broader terms of like its impact on American society or its impact on American politics or the technologies that we use. We don't
But not
often
the
think about
place itself.
exactly right. Yeah, we don't
Yeah.
often think of it as a place. And there are people that live, work, and play here, right? And they're having to deal with how this place changes. And that's what I wanted to know, right? Is like what happens and who reacts to it and who tries to shape it. And yeah, and the environment, became, I think, a really useful lens into what's happening in the valley and how people are reacting to all those changes.
For many people, the idea of like a history of Silicon Valley on its face, I think they assume would probably be fairly, positivist, triumphant, a story of progress and all these good things. And I mean, you open early in your book an introduction talking about the idea of green urbanism. So even if, okay, this is going to be a story about urban development, which sometimes can be dirty and problematic, Silicon Valley really likes to present itself as something different, and it has for a long time. And I always have to apologize when I quote people to themselves, but here's something that you write in the introduction, because this signals to the readers that that's not the story that's going to be told here. This is going to be a counter narrative. You write the pursuit of green urbanism, which like applause, like all around. Yes, the pursuit of green urbanism. This sounds great. We're all on board. But then you continue. led to a worsening environment as high-tech industrialization, suburban growth, and urban expansion fueled, and here's the list that I think will really shock a lot of people. It fueled declines in human health, worsened race and class stratification, strengthened the political power of elites, and introduced widespread environmental degradation. So much for green urbanism. So in the early stage of this project, as you're thinking about water and the environment and all of that, were you already clued into these ideas of social economic inequality that really are the other big kind of foundational idea that you're working through? Was that something you knew you were going to find, or did you find it
Mhm.
along the way? Or what was like the first thing that clued you in, like, oh, there's another story here going on?
That's a good question. I don't think I knew right away. I think where this starts is, well, I think where this started was thinking about these water issues, right? And so there was a point in which this book really was going to be all about water. I didn't end up doing that, obviously, but as I was looking for these things, I mean, I was coming across things like reservoir projects and aqueducts. California is a famously dry place. Even in the valley where it, was like great agricultural land, it still had a lot of drought issues
It's
and
a
other
desert
things.
coast.
Yeah, exactly, right. It's beautiful, but it has, it's got challenges. I think the thing that started to clue me into this, though, was as I was looking at different water issues, I forget whose paper I was in. It was one of the senators for this part of California. But I remember picking up this folder about water pollution, and I opened this thing, and there's like a newspaper clipping in there, and it's this list of cities throughout the Bay Area that have contaminated well water, and the headline something like something about high tech and all these like drinking water contaminations, and people can't drink the water, and there's all these people getting sick, and it's all like, holy cow, what have I come across?
And was it in the papers explicitly linked to the high-tech industry?
Yes,
In
yes,
these newspaper articles and stuff, it was already being identified as that's the source of the
yeah,
pollution?
yeah. I mean, what happens is there's a leak that's discovered in '82 by some construction workers, and the company responsible for it and the water company sit on the news for about a month, and then the San Jose Mercury breaks the story open in like January of '83, and it's very clear, like they make no hesitation about it. Like the responsibility is with this company because they had been storing these chemical solvents, and they found a leak, and that leak had been going on for a long time because nobody was monitoring it, and all this water is contaminated. I think what was missing yet, although it comes forward pretty quickly, is like what is the effect of that contamination? And you have a neighborhood literally across the street from this company, a woman by the name of Lorraine Ross, who, her daughter had been born with a heart defect. And there'd been like other stories around this neighborhood of women in particular who were getting sick or their children were getting sick. And she immediately makes this connection of like, oh, this place, which has been leaking stuff into our drinking water, they're the reason that we feel this way, or they're the reason that our children are having these things happen to us. And very quickly you get other organizations. There's a group that sort of emerges out of all of this called the Silicon Valley Toxics Coalition, which springs up and is really designed to sort of one represent these neighborhoods in particular, but it's also like a public advocacy group, and they're doing a lot of work in newspapers and flyers and community gatherings and events to try and like highlight, hey, there's a problem here. Because very quickly, of course, the county and others need to start testing all the water everywhere, and it turns out that like almost every well they test has been contaminated. So you can't use the aquifer water, you can't use the well water, and so there's a lot of concern, of course, about what does this all mean. And of course, water underground flows just like water above ground, and so like the chemicals also don't just stay in one spot; they're everywhere, right? And they're moving, and so there's also this rush to figure out where things are going and who's at risk for certain things. And yeah, very explicitly making this connection. I think the other thing too that makes this connection pretty explicit is there was another organization focused particularly on people working in these facilities, the manufacturing facilities for electrical components and other things. And as like a labor issue, they were very keyed in, I think, to the ways that, people building silicon chips and wafers and other things also were getting sick. They were getting, ranging everything from asthma to, skin lesions to other things. And so I think there was also this like sense in the valley that high tech, despite its claims of being like clean and green, really, really was not. And there's a lot of like caustic stuff and chemicals and other things that go into building the things that we use every day now, right, for computers. But a lot of that stuff is really terrible for humans, and it's really terrible for the environment.
That was not part of their early conversation, though. That's not how they were presenting themselves. I mean, like mining, I think from day one, people know there's some issues here with mining, right?
Right. I mean, the valley, I think, very much pitches itself, or I should say industry in the valley, not the valley itself. High-tech industry really does pitch itself as being very different from like steel age industries, right? They don't have smokestacks, they don't have giant warehouses, they don't have, I don't know, dirty rail yards, whatever, right? Like whatever sort of image you can think of as industrial pollution, right? In the case of computers, like, oh, we're building electronics, we're building computers, we're building things that are really tiny, we're building like guidance systems.
It's clean and it's sterile.
Exactly right. And I think that really does even go down to the design of the buildings in which the manufacturing happens, right? These are like 2-story buildings. They're nicely landscaped. They've got like glass walls, all the parking's behind the building, so you don't see all the people coming in. Like there's a very intentional way in which, Margaret Amara and others, John Finley and others have written about this too, of like, there's a very intentional way in which these tech companies do try to sort of provide this image of themselves being sort of clean and just different, right? Like this is the future of American industry, and the way it's going to look also really does matter.
Well, we kind of gotten ahead of ourselves a little bit, but that's fine. But I want to kind of rewind then back to the mid 20th century. You open your book with this vignette about Wallace Stegner. He's this professor at Stanford at the time, and you share how he's kind of bemoaning the recent changes to the Santa Clara Valley, and the orchards are gone. And I think he says that the landscape was then, quote, crusted with houses. That's a great phrase. This is definitely Wallace Stegner.
Yeah.
Crusted with houses. Great. Hilltops flattened, creeks turned into concrete storm drains.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you're signaling at the very beginning of your book that this is, you're going to be investigating a landscape that changed dramatically. Give us a sense of what was the prior landscape, kind of like late 19th century, early 20th century, kind of maybe up to World War II. What had the Santa Clara Valley looked like before that Stegner was now kind of upset was gone?
Yeah, I think if you were to visit the valley, even as late as, if you could time travel back to 1925, 1930, I think what you would have seen is, this place it was farmland, right? It was an agricultural place. And in a lot of ways, the land here, it was almost perfectly suited for agriculture. The soil is incredibly rich. The mountains and the ocean really do sort of buffer, extremes in temperatures. You get pretty good rainfall. It's everything you'd kind of want as a farmer. And if you went there, I mean, what you would see is primarily you would see orchards. It was an orchard heavy place, growing a lot of apricots, cherries, that kind of thing. I think at one point the valley supplied something like half of the world's apricot production and distribution over the world. I mean, it's just a crazy number. That was true, I think, in the 1920s or so, around there. You also would have seen ranches, cattle and other industries would have been pretty common. And a lot of these cities would have been fairly small. I mean, San Jose now is like the biggest city in the valley, but in the 1930s and 40s, this place is like a farm market town. It's pretty small. It does some distribution work in agriculture. It does a lot of like fruit processing and distribution, canning, that kind of thing. I think if you go further north, that changes a little bit. San Francisco, for example, has always kind of been a big urban place. But if you keep down in the valley itself, a lot of these places are pretty small, and they really do hug the bottom of the valley. There's not a lot of development that's happened on the valley hillsides that much. And you do get a few places, I suppose, that are sort of hugging the bay. Mountain View, for example, has been there for a long time. It used to be a big logging and shipping place. But really, I mean, this place would have been just covered in orchards, really.
So by Stegner's time, and I think that was 65, or when your book ends in the 1980s, there's been a dramatic change.
Yes.
But as an environmental history, you do maybe less work with like the land and the ecology and those kinds of things than people might think. And instead, you're focusing on What are the decisions that people are making that then, are impacting the environment? Early on, you talk a lot about Stanford, and early on, they were the largest landowner in that area. So if they control so much of the land, were they the ones who were leasing it out for agricultural development and so forth?
Yeah, exactly. And that's by design, right? So when the university was chartered, the land is very explicitly like you can't sell it, but you can use it in certain ways.
But the university needed money, and they probably wanted to sell it
Precisely. Yeah.
at
And I think
various points. Yeah.
especially, yeah, I think especially true, by the 1930s, 1940s, university really is hurting for cash. And yeah, I mean, a lot of the land as a money-making venture for the university really was leased out to ranchers in particular. I don't know if anybody's listening has been to Stanford, but it is, it's kind of in the hillsides, so it's not particularly well suited for an orchard or something like that. But there are ways that you could do other commodity work on this land. And yeah,
Mhm.
primarily leased it out for agricultural purposes.
So by the early 1950s, they start to come up with some new ideas, and they are in cahoots. Well, maybe that's kind of pejorative. They're collaborating with suburban developers and boosters. What's some of the new kinds of land use that they start encouraging, and what's the vision they kind of are projecting out onto the landscape by the time we get to the early 50s that's different from just that straight agricultural world?
So Stanford by the 1940s and 1950s, even with things like the GI Bill that brings a lot of new people, certainly there's a lot of military people that go through Oakland or Sunnyvale during World War II. A lot of them come back and go to college at Stanford, but the university's still kind of hurting for money. The way this starts to shake out is there are professors and administrators at Stanford who sort of learn a lot from the war years, basically. And they're looking at places like MIT or Harvard who end up, in a lot of ways, pioneering these relationships between university and industry. Universities start to realize, like, oh, if we set up contractual relationships between our faculty and industry, or if we start offering coursework to people in industry who can attend our university at, like, say, discounted costs or something like that, we can actually make a lot of money. Alongside that, you have the federal government who is very interested in developing, new defense mechanisms, improvements on things like radio and radar in particular when you're talking about World War II. These administrators at Stanford sort of come home after the war having seen all this, and they realize, like, Stanford really is missing out. Like, Stanford would be a much wealthier place. I mean, Stanford in the 1940s is like a middling college, right? It's not a research powerhouse in the way that universities in the East are. But I think you have this moment where certain administrators are really wanting to find a way for Stanford to be more than what it is. And so World War II really does open the floodgates for this.
And they
Right.
could look down to Los Angeles or up to Seattle and see how defense industries transformed those places, like brought in so much revenue and development. So why not there too, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And I think Los Angeles, especially, I think is their like guiding star, in a lot of ways.
But you're right how they kind of wanted to do it differently. They intentionally wanted to promote not just any industry, but tech, or what they called light industry,
Yeah.
as kind of a clean, more environmentally friendly kind of development. What are
Mhm.
the kinds of early businesses that they're giving these leases out to try to encourage these businesses to set up shop next door so they can cultivate these relationships, with Stanford and whatnot? Like, what are those early light industry or clean early tech type things?
Yeah. One of the earliest things that Stanford does is in 1954, they decide to make a spot of land that they call the Stanford Industrial Park. And the industrial park really is their opportunity to try to do something different, right? They see they can get a lot more money out of high tech than they can out of ranchers as somebody leasing the land. And so they start to work primarily with aerospace industry folks. And so they're pulling in people like Lockheed, for example. Lockheed Missile and Aerospace is one of the earliest tenants at the Stanford Industrial Park. But you also have people like Kodak and different organizations, or excuse me, different companies that are primarily working on, again, radar systems or vacuum tubes or things like that. The other thing you end up getting is students at Stanford who are graduating and then starting their own companies, often with the support of the dean of engineering or something at the university. There are several students who end up creating companies here, right? Hewlett and Packard is they were both students at Stanford and they create Hewlett Packard just down the road from the university. And that, now it's a global computer powerhouse and has been for decades. But you have a lot of these people out here who are trying to build electrical components primarily aimed at the defense industry. And yeah, I mean, Stanford just pulls in because of that and because of these relationships. Stanford just begins to pull in just millions of dollars out of these defense contracts.
So it's a successful scheme.
Very much so.
Financially.
Yeah. Yes.
But this is then going to bring suburban development along with it. All these new businesses, that means there needs to be places
Correct.
for people to live.
Mhm.
You write about how this is very much a story about real estate and land.
Mhm.
And a lot of this new population is largely white, privileged, and they were looking for a specific kind of, I think you say like a rural aesthetic.
Yeah.
That they were promoting for this kind of suburban landscape. But this is one of the early things that was kind of a little light bulb moment as I was working through your book, is that, I mean, this sounds great, like a kind of rural aesthetic, suburban development, but not everyone was welcome. Not everyone
Yeah.
was included. And so you
Yeah.
have these nice, white picket fence neighborhoods next to, more orchards and ranches that were still around, but the people working those ranches are predominantly brown,
Yes.
and they're not living in these suburbs.
Right.
So here's where
Yeah.
we start to get some of the racial segregation, inequality type things. What were city planners or city councils or local and state governments doing in this post-World War II era to intentionally kind of segregate out what populations were living where? Because this is going to be important for then the environmental costs that different populations bear, right?
Right.
So how do they do that? How do they effectively segregate the landscape?
I think there's a few ways that we see this happen, I guess, in the historical record. One of the ways that we see this is really about how city planners define certain spaces within the city. Most cities are, at least in the valley here, are intended or obligated, I guess, to have a master plan, right? And that master plan really is designed to sort of guide urban development over the course of, a decade or two or something like that. One of the ways we see this play out in San Jose, and I think San Jose is a particularly apt example because it's the fastest urbanizing place in the valley through this period, but also just reflects a lot of these kind of challenges. But when the city puts out its master plan in 1958, one of the things it's trying to do is identify what it considers blighted neighborhoods. And what's interesting, or what I found about this that was interesting, is those blighted neighborhoods also sort of line up with the homeowners loan corporation ratings on how well a neighborhood can be, financed or mortgaged. These blighted neighborhoods, as the city sees it anyway, are predominantly places where populations are particularly non-white. And, if a place is blighted, the city says, well, we have two options here. We can either revitalize this place or we can raise this place. And more often than not, the decision was, well, this neighborhood isn't worth saving. We're going to do something else here instead. In some cases, that meant we're going to put the interstate right here. And when that kind of things happens, the people that were living there have to go somewhere. And, the city's not providing any kind of support mechanisms or anything like that to help people move out of these places or resettle them in places that are particularly nice, even really. And so a lot of people get pushed east, right? Mexican American communities in particular get pushed pretty far east, sort of out of the city. But I think the other thing you kind of see happen too is there are ways in which urban growth, especially in a place like San Jose, the consequences of that growth also get offloaded onto non-white populations. And the way that looks in the valley or in San Jose, for example, is if you look at sewage. And let me tell you, when I started this, I never thought I'd be thinking about sewage as much as I do now. But uh, but it's interesting because San Jose already had a pretty substantial system for this. They were a major fruit cannery place, right? And so they had to move effluents quickly and easily already and dump all that into the bay or whatever. But in the case of San Jose, like, they've got this just ballooning population that they have to deal with. And of course, all of the sanitation and other things that come along with that. And their solution is to build, of course, a new sewage treatment facility. Well, where does that go? It goes north of the city, right next to a place called El Viso, which is predominantly a Latino community. So it's not in the western parts of San Jose, which is almost entirely white by the 1950s and 1960s. It's outside of those pockets of people. And so there's also things like racial covenants, even though they're not technically legal. You still have real estate developers who are discouraging certain populations from settling in certain areas. And so, yeah, there's both like infrastructural ways in which the city tries to guide where people end up. There's also just like straight out, racial ways of thinking about these neighborhoods and where people end up.
This redlining is this process of trying to legally restrict, and often with racial covenants and on people's deeds or with loan agreements and so forth. That's not unique to here, but I don't think we often consider the environmental implications of that, because the places where then these marginalized populations are going to be directed or allowed to live, of course, those are going to be the places where the cities say, well, that's where the sewage treatment plant goes, or that's
Right.
where we maybe don't invest as much in flood control or infrastructure.
Yep.
Or all kinds of other things that make it a more healthy environment. This then leads us to some of the resistance. These populations don't just roll over.
Mhm.
Talk to us about Cesar Chavez, who pops up in this story, and
Yeah.
the community service organization, the CSO. So, because they're aware of these problems. So how are they
Yes, very much so.
pushing? How are they trying to resist or reform?
Chavez is one of these people in this book that I actually wasn't anticipating would be in this book, but here he is.
I
Um,
I didn't see it coming.
yeah, this is really where he gets his start as an activist. Chavez is a resident in a neighborhood called Mayfair, and Mayfair it's a Latino community. It's been a Latino community for a very, very long time, at least since the 1910s, 1920s. Primarily immigrant communities coming up for work, and then they'd settle here and then perhaps go back home and come back for the next season. Mayfair by the 1950s and 1960s is a place that's sort of forgotten by the city, I guess, by San Jose. It's none of the streets are paved. Every time it rains a lot in the valley, and so of course every time it rains, like the streets are just pockmarked with mud, and it's difficult to get around. There's a nickname for one of the districts here called Sal se puedes, which means get out if you can, which I think at one point meant like good luck with the rain, but also then comes to mean like a socioeconomic, like get out if you can kind of thing. But yeah, Chavez sort of pairs up with some other folks who are doing, work in these neighborhoods. I mean, these neighborhoods are just, there's like disease is very common. You have like open cesspools and other things that are easily spreading disease. You have the street problems. You have no lighting. You don't really have access to certain city services, whether that's good schools or police or fire protection. And so Chavez and many others within his community start to work with both with like local churches, Catholic churches, but also with Fred Ross, who's doing a lot of work with Saul Alinsky's organization. And, they end up really developing this like voter registration drive, which is sort of the moment where all of this starts to come together. Because they realize like one of the things that's missing here is political power. And if there's a way in which we can help get different people into the city council, well, then perhaps our neighborhoods will get the same treatment that, white neighborhoods will get, for example. And so they do this big voter registration drive in, I think, 53, 54, and which totally freaks out the city council. And, suddenly, very quickly, you've got paved streets and you have street lighting, and it all happens rather quickly. But, that's like, it's not the end of the fight, right? And unfortunately, in this case, this is all happening, as I said, in Mayfair. And Mayfair is the place that gets identified, even with these improvements, as a blighted place. And if you go to Mayfair today, there's a interstate interchange sitting on that spot. And so, the city still, even after, this sort of capital expenditures and other things to build infrastructure, still deem it as a place that's not worth keeping. And, an interstate I guess, makes better sense to the city council.
But these aren't the only people resisting. You also write about predominantly white groups, kind of anti-growth resistance groups who are trying to fight against the encroachment of high-tech urban development. So they're also resisting some of the city planning and development decisions that are going on, but for wildly different reasons and some different strategies. What does that movement look like, maybe in comparison to Chavez or some of the others that are thinking more about the plight of marginalized, socially depressed communities?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of communities that really try to grapple with the changes happening in this valley. I mean, like where we started with this conversation, thinking about the landscape as Stegner saw it in 1965. These people also are experiencing all these changes. They're, living and working in the same place. And, some of these are newcomers, or I guess a lot of these are newcomers who, again, come to the valley for a particular kind of experience, whether that's the sort of countryside life or the sort of white collar affluent life that people sort of associate with the valley, or even just with California in general, since California has this kind of like mystique about itself, I think. And there are various groups, I think, that spring up as part of this. Some of these groups are conservationists. This would include, I think, Wallace Stegner, who helps found this group called the Committee for Green Foothills. He's living, I think, just west of Stanford at this point, up in the foothills. And again, kind of looking down at the valley and seeing all these changes. And him and his neighbors are very upset about all this. And they don't want to see these things continue to happen. They win a couple of fights with the university to protect, certain hillsides and things like that. But it really is a campaign that goes on for a long time. And the Committee for Green Foothills is still around. They're still doing conservation work throughout the valley. You do have other Latino groups who are doing certain kinds of sort of community activism for their neighborhoods. We see this in El Viso, for example. I mentioned a little bit ago, it was the sewage treatment place for San Jose. But again, they're also trying to fight for this like suburban vision of their life, right? They want the same kind of experience. They want the same kind of treatment that these white communities are getting. And they're working very hard to try to get that. They're also stacked up, though, of course, against other developers and things like that. And they have a much harder time succeeding, I think, because of that.
Yeah, once this ball gets rolling, did they really stand any chance of stopping it? Or at the time, did they realize that it was unstoppable and maybe the best they could do was steer it in certain directions?
That's a good question.
It just seems like once there's enough inertia behind this kind of development, like I just, what can you do effectively? And maybe
Yeah.
that's why Stegner was writing about it, because maybe he could sense like some things have happened here without us realizing it, and now maybe it's too late to fully put the genie back in the bottle or Pandora's box. But I kind of got that sense a little bit, perhaps.
I think it does come to a point where people really are trying to manage the fallout rather than prevent it, right? And so whether that's people like Stanford, or whether that's people like Stegner and these different conservation groups trying to do certain things, there's a pretty concerted effort, even within like the county government system, trying to preserve farmland. For example, there's a big movement to try and keep these like belts of farmland around, which again doesn't really succeed, but they try and manage, this growth. They don't succeed because capital expenditures and real estate development just are more lucrative, and they have a hard time resisting city governments and the things they want to do. But yeah, I do think there's a sense in which they're trying to manage this, and whether that means we protect certain pockets of farmland, or we start to buy up land and put it into like an environmental trust. There's a big movement that starts for that in the 1960s and 70s. There are ways that I think people are trying to sort of manage or protect what's left from development until you get like this political shift, I think, that happens in the 1970s.
So we already talked about a couple examples of the pollution that's specifically coming out of this tech industry. And it's like,
Yeah.
and this whole project is one of bringing in clean, light industry that would be matched with this kind of rural, rustic, suburban visual aesthetic. I mean, and it all sounds great. And it makes me wonder if awareness of the pollution had come sooner, if maybe the development would have been altered dramatically. Because them realizing like, oh, this light industry is not that clean, that comes a little bit too late.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think there were a lot of people very surprised by what was happening, right? I mean, there's even
Like,
the
this is the
mayor saying,
opposite of what we were trying to do.
exactly, yeah. And there's a line from the mayor of San Jose who's like, well, there were no smokestacks. So we didn't think there'd be a problem, kind of thing. I mean, I think one of the things that's important to remember about Silicon Valley in this period is that it is a manufacturing place, right? It's not what it is today, which is primarily software. It was something very different, and they were building stuff, and to build stuff, you had to have these chemicals and other things. And I think people in the valley, living in the valley, for the most part, just didn't really see that. I think there's a tendency that because there are a lot of white collar scientists, they're doing interesting research and development in these nicely landscaped buildings, but we don't think too much about what's actually happening in these buildings. And I think that's true even if you look at like the people who are literally building the chips and wafers, the blue collar workers, who are the ones that are like getting exposed to crazy stuff and getting sick and whatnot. I think most of that is sort of invisible to a lot of people living in the valley because again, like, well, we were told this was clean and green. We were told that this is, it doesn't look like, I don't know, Detroit or something like that, where
Mhm.
it's, there's other problems. Or even as like certain pollution stories start to come out in the 70s, it's like, oh well, we don't have buried oil drums. We don't have rivers on fire. We're different. But in fact, you weren't. In fact, it was all very of the same thing in a lot of ways.
That's why they're built those buildings look the way they did. They look like
That's right.
hospitals. They
They
they were
really do.
very
Yeah.
intentionally trying to visually look clean
Yep.
and so forth. To try to kind of wrap all this up, how can we zoom out and apply this to how we think about the West more broadly?
Mhm.
There are things here that are completely unique to Silicon Valley history. But just a couple weeks ago, I saw an article about a farm project somewhere in kind of the high desert areas around Reno, I think. And there was some local resistance to that. Or we here in Utah, we've had multiple like Amazon and Facebook, and I don't remember all the companies that wanted to build huge server farms here, and we're like, hey, we don't have any water. Uh,
Right.
you know, that's maybe an issue. What is applicable to other regions in the West from your study that we should be
Yeah.
thinking about? And maybe even divorced from like tech industry stuff, but
Mm.
how can we use your work as a lens to view where the rest of us live? Or like where you live now, kind of in rural Nebraska. How can we make use of this?
That's a really good question. I think there's maybe a few things to take away from that. I mean, I think about the land a lot. That's like what I do. And, that was the case in Silicon Valley, both as I lived there, but also as I've written this book. I think about land and land use a lot, both here in Nebraska, but also just across the West. I think there's a way in which, as a resident of a Western state, I think paying attention to what happens to the land around you is just really important. I think there's ways in which land use decisions, I mean, some of the stuff I write about, I think actually could be considered quite boring. It's like I think there's a lot of like urban planning documents and other things that are just like really dense or hard to read or, they sort of expect the authors of those things sort of expect the kind of experience or expertise that I think average people, myself included, just can't really penetrate. But we ask a lot of things of land. And, land can only have a few purposes at a time, really. If we make a decision that land is belongs to industry, well, then it's no longer a place for a child's playground or something like that. And I think like being aware of certain decisions and who's making those decisions about the land around you or things even just within your neighborhood is important. And I think it also kind of speaks to, I guess, this like democratic impulse to be involved in these local
Sure.
decisions in particular. Like, don't leave it all to developers. Don't leave it all to even outside influences who may be buying up land or something like that. I think people need to have sort of an ear to the ground and have a way to like make your voice heard and make sure that you can say something about the land and changes that are happening around you. I think there is still a tech angle to this too. As you mentioned, there's the data center thing that is, I think, more and more an issue that we're having to deal with. And I think it's actually, in this case, a particularly Western issue. because it is a a rural place that we have space for data farms and other things. But there are, I think, other places that are analogous to what happened in Silicon Valley. Phoenix remains or at least at one point was a tech manufacturing place. You can see this in Seattle. You can see it in Portland. You can even see it, I think, in a few places here on the plains, maybe to a lesser extent. It is kind of in a lot of ways, I feel like high tech is this like far west story more than it is like Intermountain or Great Plains story. Much to the consternation, I think, of some Great Plains senators at the time. But I do think there's like things to be aware of about land use, about water and water pollution. Here in Nebraska, there's always debates going on about things like nitrates in the water and farm runoff and things like that. And just being aware of those sort of environmental changes that happen within a place.
Well, to wrap up, you want to tell us about what you're working on now that this book is out?
Yeah, I actually just got back from a research trip. I was away in Laramie, Wyoming last week, which was great. I hadn't been in an archive in a little while, so it was fun to look at some stuff. Yeah, so I'm returning to a project I started in grad school, like in 20, oh gosh, I don't even know if I could put a year on it, 2011, 2012, maybe somewhere in there. I wrote a paper for John Wonder, and this paper was about the Sagebrush Rebellion, which you may know about as a Utah person. But for the
Yep.
listeners that may not know, the Sagebrush Rebellion was an attempt by some Western states, I think particularly in the Intermountain West, but elsewhere too,
Hmm.
to try and more or less seize control of federal lands, primarily Bureau of Land Management land and some Forest Service land, to take that land out of federal management and put it in control of the states and let the states decide what happens to that land.
This is like late 70s.
Yep. Yeah, this is emerging in the late 70s. It sort of kicks off, I think, or I guess not kicks off, but it coalesces, let's say, in Nevada in 1979. You see this legislation emerge in Nevada, and then there's attempts in Utah and Wyoming and Arizona, and a few other places across the West. What got interesting to me in that project is one of the states that tried to pass legislation for seizing public land was South Dakota. I grew up in South Dakota, and I thought it was really weird that South Dakota, of all places, would be interested in seizing public land, because the public land in South Dakota is it's like 2% of the land, maybe, and almost all of it's in the Black Hills. It's not ranch land, so you wouldn't use it for ranching. I suppose you could use it for mining or timber work, but still, it was odd to me that South Dakota, of all places, wanted to do something with this, or found any like political affinity at all, really, with the Sagebrush Rebellion. So anyway, I wrote this paper for John Wonder, trying to think about this and figure it out. And I didn't feel particularly great about where I left that, but it's been a project or a topic that's been on my mind for a long time, and so I'm returning to that. I think the things that are interesting about this project are, there's a couple of things I think I'm trying to do. It's early days yet, so who knows? But one is I'm pushing the story north and east a little bit. Again, I think it's weird that South Dakota tries to do this, and I wonder about what other elements of this exist across the Northern Plains.
Hmm.
And so I'm thinking about the Northern Plains a lot.
For listeners, they're like, "Oh, this sounds like exactly what lots of states are doing right now." And they may not be aware there's actually a
Yes.
40, 50-year precedent from the late 70s, early 80s. So very relevant. I'll be interested to see
Yeah.
if, as you expand the geography of that story from 50 years ago, I'll be interested to see how it resonates with today in unique ways, because that movement has today is much more than just, Utah,
Right.
Nevada.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the other thing that I'm trying to do that makes this an interesting project, at least for me, is, the Silicon Valley book was very local, right? I was at times writing just about even specific neighborhoods. But the Sagebrush Project is a regional story, as I see it. And writing something that much bigger, it just feels like an interesting challenge to me. And so, yeah, I think I'm going to have a lot of fun thinking about these Northern Plains states and the grasslands and people's relationship to it. So,
That sounds great. Jason, I always give people congratulations on their books, but you've also written this while working a bunch of different jobs, doing things in digital history that weren't this book. And so, for people with your career path, special kudos and congratulations to
Well, thank you.
getting this out, because
I appreciate
that's
that.
not easy.
I appreciate it.
Well, thanks for spending a little time with us. I look
Yeah,
forward to chatting more. We'll see each other at a conference sometime soon.
of course.
But congrats on the book. It was great, and good luck on this new work that you're chewing on.
Thank you. Yeah, no, and thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun.
We'll talk to you soon, Jason.
Alrighty.
Take care.
You too, Brandon. Thanks.
Thank you so much for listening. I hope you'll subscribe and listen every month. Please leave us a review on whatever app or platform you're listening through, and follow us on Facebook, Blue Sky, or X Twitter. On those platforms, you can get updates, leave comments, and share episodes with your friends, family, and colleagues. Writing Westward is supported by the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University. We are an interdisciplinary research center that supports academic research and the promotion of public understanding of the North American West. We host regular public lectures, which we live stream on our YouTube and Facebook pages, have an annual funding cycle with awards, grants, and fellowship categories that nearly anyone can apply for if they are researching or working on the region from any disciplinary approach or towards any final product. Learn more at Redd Center, that's REDD Center.byu.edu. Our theme music was provided by local Utah composer Micah Dahl Anderson. His website is also linked in the show notes. As the podcast host, producer, sound engineer, publicist, and everything else, you can direct any praise or critique my way. I'm the author and editor of a number of books, articles, and chapters on the North American West, borderlands, Native peoples, genocide studies, religion, and the environment. My recent books include a 2018 volume, Native Foreign, Indigenous Immigrants and Refugees in the North American Borderlands, which won the Best Historical Nonfiction Book Award from the Western Writers of America, a 2019 anthology I co-edited with P. Jane Hafen, Essays on American Indian and Mormon History, which won the Metcalf Best Anthology Book Prize from the John Whitmer Historical Association, and a 2022 collection of essays I edited entitled The North American West in the 21st Century. I also recently launched and will be editing a new series for the University of New Mexico Press entitled The West in Context. Send me a note if you have a manuscript to propose for publication. Here at the Redd Center, I'm also the general editor and project manager of a great digital public history project, Intermountain Histories. It's a free mobile app and website, intermountainhistories.org, that curates student-researched and written microhistories of the region, complete with archival photos, bibliographies, and more. To contact me about the podcast, my own research, or anything else, head to bwrensink.org, email me at bwrensink@byu.edu, or follow me on Blue Sky or X Twitter at Brendan W. Rensink. Until next month, be well, be curious, be kind. Cheers.